Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on a really critical moment in World War II, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy, September 1943.
That's right. We've dug into a lot of material on this campaign, trying to pull out the key decisions, what really happened on the ground, and the water.
And our mission here is to sort of unpack all that complexity for you, give you the essential story, the strategy, the fighting, the surprises, help you get up to speed quickly.
Yeah, because there's a lot there. We'll get into the arguments among the Allies, should they even be in Italy,
Yeah.
how the Germans fought back harder than expected even after Italy surrendered, that near disaster on the beaches at Salerno,
Right.
and, why winning the South just led to this incredibly tough fight going north.
Okay, let's set the scene. This is right after the Allies successfully invaded Sicily, summer of 43. So the big question for the leadership was, what next?
And it wasn't simple. There was a real split, mostly between the British and the Americans. Churchill was the main guy pushing for Italy.
The soft underbelly idea, right?
Exactly. He thought they could knock Italy out, force Germany to pull troops from Russia or France, open up the Med for shipping, which was huge. Shipping was tight. And, finally give Stalin that second front he kept asking for.
But the U.S. military planners, they saw it differently.
Yeah, back in Washington, they were laser focused on the main event, the cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord. They were really worried that getting sort of bogged down in Italy would delay the big push into France.
So a compromise then.
Pretty much. After Sicily, they agreed, okay, let's keep the pressure on in Italy, but don't let it mess up the Overlord timetable. And then Mussolini falls in July. And suddenly, a bigger Italian operation, maybe combining landings, seemed, more doable.
Do they know how hard it would be? I mean, they must have expected resistance.
They knew it wouldn't be a cakewalk, sure, but they probably underestimated the German reaction. There were risks, Germans escaping Sicily, Italy becoming a supply headache, but the German resistance turned out tougher than maybe they hoped. The Germans were actually quite prepared.
So how did the invasion plan itself come together?
Well, the first thought was smaller. Just hop across the Straits of Messina from Sicily to the toe of Italy, Calabria.
Okay.
But it grew more ambitious. A two-pronged attack. The British Eighth Army does that crossing, but also a big American-led landing much further up the coast.
And that became Salerno. Why Salerno specifically?
Key reason seems to be air cover. It was just about in range of the Allied fighter planes based on those newly captured airfields in Sicily. Geography-wise, maybe not the obvious first choice, but air support was absolutely critical.
Gotcha. So two main landings then. What was the first one?
Operation Baytown. That was the British Eighth Army crossing to the toe on September 3rd. Interesting thing is, their commander, Montgomery, he actually argued against it.
Really? Why?
He predicted the Germans wouldn't really fight hard there. He thought they'd pull back, use demolitions, the mountains, make the advance slow that way. And, well, he was right. Eighth Army pushed north nearly 500 kilometers, but mostly against blown bridges and roadblocks, not heavy fighting.
So Montgomery called that one. What about airborne operations? Were those planned?
Oh, yeah, some pretty ambitious ones. Gliders were going to seize passes above Salerno initially, but that got canceled. Then there was Operation Giant II.
Giant.
Drop the 82nd Airborne near Rome to help the Italians secure the city. This was tied into the whole Italian surrender negotiation.
So what happened with that?
It was incredibly close. They sent Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, from the 82nd secretly into Rome to check things out.
Wow.
And he basically reported back, look, the Italians can't hold the airfields, the Germans are all over, this is a trap. He got the message out literally as paratroopers were boarding the planes, so canceled at the very last minute. Saved a lot of lives, probably.
Okay, so no Rome draw. That leaves the main event.
Yeah.
Operation Avalanche. Salerno, September 9th.
That's the big one. U.S. Fifth Army, which was actually a mix of American and British units under American command, General Mark Clark. Objectives: grab the port of Naples fast for supplies, then drive across Italy to the east coast, trapping German forces down south.
Must have been a huge naval operation.
Massive. Over 600 ships. But air cover was still a worry. The land-based planes from Sicily couldn't stay over Salerno long enough, so they had to bring in escort carriers for close support right off the beaches. A big risk for the carriers.
And Avalanche had challenges built in from the start, didn't it?
Definitely. The landing zone was huge, 56 kilometers wide, but only 3 divisions hitting the beach initially. And the American Sixth Corps and the British X Corps were separated by this big gap, like 19 kilometers, right around the Sully River.
A gap. That sounds risky.
It was. And Clark hadn't assigned specific troops initially to cover that boundary, plus the terrain. Hills overlooking the beaches, perfect for defenders, and they only had about 45 days to plan the whole thing. Super tight.
You mentioned rangers and commandos.
Yeah, they went in first, ahead of the main waves, to grab key mountain passes inland. Vital job. Oh, and Clark decided not to do a pre-landing naval bombardment. He thought the German defenders were too spread out for it to be effective. And then they hit minefields offshore. Just added to the problems.
Okay, what about the Germans? How are they set up?
They were organized. Kesselring was the commander in the south. They totally expected Italy to surrender and had Operation Écoi ready to disarm Italian troops fast. They'd even formed a brand new army, the 10th Army, under von Wiedinghoff, specifically to counter the landings.
So they knew where the Allies might land.
They had a good idea. They positioned divisions to cover the likely spots, including the 16th Panzer Division, a really strong unit sitting back in the hills, just off the Salerno plain, ready to pounce. They weren't planning to die on the beaches. They planned to counterattack hard.
Right, let's get into the battles then. Baytown, in the tow.
Pretty much as Montgomery predicted. Light resistance initially. Italian units mostly gave up. The Germans pulled their main forces back, left delaying units. The 8th Army advanced, but slowly. Demolition.
And Operation Slapstick, the other landing at Taranto.
Totally different. The Italian armistice was announced just as they were arriving. So the British 1st Airborne came ashore, basically unopposed, took the port of Taranto without a fight.
Smooth sailing then.
Mostly. There was one tragic incident. A British mine-laying ship, HMS Abdiel, hit a German mine in the harbor and sank. A lot of casualties.
That's terrible.
Yeah. And there were some later classes inland with German paratroopers. The British airborne commander, Major General Hopkinson, was actually killed in one of those small fights, but the ports of Taranto, Brindisi, Bari, they were secured quickly.
Okay, now for the main event, Avalanche. Salerno, September 9th. This is where it gets rough.
It really does, and zero tactical surprise. Sources even describe loudspeakers set up on the shore by the Germans broadcasting in English. Come on in and give up, we have you covered.
Wow. Talk about psychological warfare.
Right. And the 16th Panzer wasn't waiting on the beach. Their battle groups were maybe 10 kilometers inland, ready to hit the Allies once they were ashore and trying to move inland.
How did the landings go in the British sector, X-Corps?
Kind of mixed. The U.S. Rangers and British commandos landing on the flanks actually got ashore mostly unopposed. They quickly secured those vital mountain passes. The commandos pushed into Salerno town itself, captured it after some tough fighting, took some casualties, about 9 killed, 37 wounded there.
But the main infantry landings?
They ran into serious trouble. The 46th and 56th Divisions hit determined German fire from well-sighted positions in the hills overlooking their beaches. They absolutely needed heavy naval gunfire support just to fight their way ashore and carve out a foothold. The British commanders seemed focused on consolidating, getting forces built up, rather than immediately pushing hard to link up with the Americans to their south.
And the American sector. The X-Corps opposed them.
Even tougher, especially for the 36th Infantry Division. They were green, first time in combat.
No.
And maybe they expected things to be easier after the Italian surrender announcement. But they landed right under the guns of Germans, dug in on Monte Soprano, and LST got hit badly. One infantry regiment, the 141st, kind of lost cohesion, couldn't get organized or get vital supplies ashore easily.
But some units did better.
Yeah, the 142nd and 143rd regiments managed better, largely thanks to fantastic naval gunfire support. Destroyers like USS Philadelphia and Savannah got right in close, blasting German positions. Sources say they fired something like 11,000 tons of shells just during that initial beachhead phase. Incredible firepower.
So, end of D-Day at Salerno. What's the picture?
Beachhead established, yes. But it's shallow, precarious, some key objectives not taken, and crucially, German reinforcements are already being rushed towards Salerno Hermann Göring Division, Panzergrenadiers, the initiative. It's really hanging in the balance. Neither side clearly has it yet.
And the air situation, you mentioned that was a concern.
It became critical. The Luftwaffe hit back hard and fast. Strafing, bombing runs started right on D-Day. The Allies captured Monte Corvino airfield nearby but couldn't use it because it was still under German artillery fire.
So the carriers were essential.
Absolutely. Admiral Hewitt, the naval commander, sent desperate signals. Air situation here critical. His own flagship, USS Ancon, which was also Clark's HQ, was targeted constantly. They were calling red alerts all the time. Luftwaffe flew maybe 450 sorties against the ships and beaches.
That's intense.
It was. The Allied carriers had to stay much longer than planned just to provide some cover. And the Germans had those new glide bombs, the Fritz X.
Right, you mentioned those.
Nice.
Radio controlled.
Yeah, very hard to defend against back then. They badly damaged the cruiser, USS Savannah, took her out of the fight, and later they hit the British battleship Warspite, too. So 85 Allied ships were hit one way or another off Salerno. It was dangerous offshore as well as onshore.
So the next few days, September 10th to 13th, were about consolidating.
For the Allies, yes, trying to push inland, widen the beachhead. For the Germans, it was about holding firm, delaying, buying time for more reinforcements to arrive, and position for a major counterpunch.
And Clark adjusted his plan.
He had to. Seeing the British X-Corps advancing slowly and knowing more Germans were coming, he shifted the boundary between the corps, tried to get the newly arrived 45th Division into that gap area near the Saale River.
But the German reinforcements kept coming.
They did. Maybe not always perfectly coordinated, they were arriving piecemeal, but von Wiedinghoff threw them straight into battle as they arrived. By September 12th, the Allies were actually facing a real shortage of infantry on the front lines.
So people higher up were getting worried.
Definitely. General Alexander, the overall Allied Army Group commander, sent a worried message back to London. Said something like, "I am not satisfied, buildup is slow, pinned down, not enough depth, expect heavy German counterattack to be imminent." He saw it coming.
And it came on the 13th.
It did. The main German counteroffensive. They hit exactly where Alexander feared, right on that boundary between the British and American Corps along the Saale River, aiming to split the beachhead. A Sixth Corps, the Americans took the brunt of it.
That weak spot they left open.
Precisely. The Germans identified it and hammered it. Specific German battle groups, Klein Limburg, Kruger, pushed hard. The U.S. 36th Division had taken a town, Altavilla, but got hit hard and forced back. One American battalion was overrun, another virtually wiped out. It was desperate.
This sounds like the absolute crisis point.
It was. Right where the Saale and Calore rivers meet, the Germans broke through. What stopped them? Absolute desperation. Artillery firing point blank over open sights at oncoming tanks, relentless naval gunfire pounding the German spearheads, and literally a last-ditch defense line thrown together by Major General Walker using anyone he could find, artillerymen, drivers, cooks, clerks, fighting as infantry.
Were they actually thinking about evacuating?
Well, Clark's staff definitely drew up contingency plans, code names like Brass Rail, Celian, Sea Train, just in case. Clark himself later denied he seriously considered pulling out. He was determined to fight it out, but the plans existed. That's how close it was.
Okay, so how did they turn it around from the brink of disaster?
Allied response was multifaceted. First, Visicorps had to pull back some forward units to form a more solid line. Then, crucially, reinforcements arrived. The 82nd Airborne, remember, their Rome jump was canceled.
Right.
They were diverted. The 504th and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments jumped directly into the beachhead under fire on the nights of the 13th and 14th to bolster this corps. More glider troops landed by sea. The British 7th Armored Division also started landing in the X-Corps sector, adding strength there.
So sheer firepower and reinforcements were key.
Absolutely critical. The Fifth Army's own artillery firing nonstop. The naval gunfire support, especially the Royal Navy ships, was just devastating to the German attacks. And having those elite airborne troops suddenly appear really stiffened the American line. German losses, particularly tanks, were mounting rapidly under that onslaught.
And air power?
Massive air intervention. On September 14th, Air Chief Marshal Tedder ordered basically every available plane, including the strategic heavy bombers, to hit the Germans around Salerno. Over 1,000 tons of bombs dropped that day alone. Constant air attacks continued on the 15th. It really hammered the German assembly areas and supply lines.
You mentioned battleships, too.
Yeah, the arrival of HMS Warspite and Valiant, British battleships with huge 15-inch guns, was a big morale booster. Apparently, Valiant didn't even fire, but just seeing them arrive helped. Warspite did fire, adding its weight. Although, ironically, Warspite was later hit and disabled by one of those German Fritz X glide bombs.
So the German attacks started to falter.
By the 15th, 16th, yes. They launched more attacks, particularly against the British X-Corps sector, but they were repulsed, again with heavy losses. The momentum had shifted.
What about Montgomery's 8th Army down south?
They were still advancing, slowly but surely. By September 14th, they started a more general push. On the 16th, their patrols reached Sicily. which is about 40 kilometers beyond the initial danger zone, and actually linked up with patrols from the American Sixth Corps.
So not directly involved in stopping the counterattack, but their presence mattered.
Definitely. Their approach, even if slow, posed a growing threat to von Wiedinghoff's southern flank and his rear communications. It was another major factor in his decision.
The German decision to withdraw.
Yes. On September 16th, von Wiedinghoff told Kesselring, essentially, "We can't break them. Allied air and naval power is overwhelming. We can't neutralize it. Our losses are too heavy, and Eighth Army is becoming a threat." He recommended pulling back. Kesselring agreed on the 17th. The Germans began an organized withdrawal northward.
And German accounts confirm the reason.
Absolutely. General Ballack, a panzer commander there, specifically noted how badly his tanks suffered under naval gunfire, saying they had nothing to counter it. Von Wiedinghoff's own report stated the attacks failed primarily because of fire from naval guns and low-flying aircraft. Allied firepower, directed effectively, maybe with some help from Italian partisans spotting targets, was just too much.
You mentioned something earlier, a mutiny.
Ah, yes. The Salerno Mutiny happened right around this time, September 16th. About 500 British soldiers, part of X-Corps, had arrived as replacements, but they refused orders to join new units at the front. They wanted to go back to their original units they'd been separated from earlier in North Africa.
How was that handled?
It was tense. Officers managed to persuade about half of them to comply, but the rest, nearly 200, refused and were arrested. They were court-martialed. The ringleaders were actually sentenced to death, although the sentences were later commuted and eventually suspended. It really highlights the kind of strain the men were under and the problems of managing replacements in the heat of battle.
Okay, so the beachhead is secure. The Germans are withdrawing north. What happens next?
The Allies push out. Naples is the big prize now. General Clark gets awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the crisis, by the way. There's a command change in the U.S. Corps. General Dawley is relieved, replaced by General John Lucas.
And the advance continues.
Yes. Fifth Army heads northwest towards Naples. The 82nd Airborne, now ashore, joins the British X-Corps to help flank German defenses in the mountains. The British 7th Armored Division leads the push for Naples itself. Other units clear towns like Acerno and Avellino inland.
And 8th Army on the other coast.
They kept advancing up the Adriatic side. And they captured something really important around September 27th, the Foggia airfield complex.
Why was Foggia such a big deal?
Huge strategic value. It was a massive complex of airfields. Having Foggia meant the Allies could base many more bombers and fighters in Italy itself. That extended their reach not just for the Italian campaign, but also for bombing targets in southern Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. A major objective achieved.
And the push towards Naples.
Tough fighting through the mountains south of the city. British X-Corps had to force river crossings, clear the high ground around Mount Vesuvius. Then something interesting happened in Naples itself.
What was that?
A popular uprising. Starting around September 27th, the citizens of Naples rose up against the German occupiers and remaining Italian fascist troops, the famous 4 Days of Naples. It actually helped speed up the German withdrawal from the city.
So the Allies didn't have to fight street by street.
Not entirely. The uprising disrupted the Germans significantly. On October 1st, the first Allied troops, the King's Dragoon Guards, entered Naples. By October 6th, the whole Fifth Army had reached the Volturno River north of Naples. That river formed a natural defensive line, securing Naples and the nearby airfields. Eighth Army reached a similar river line on their side. Southern Italy was basically secured.
So looking back at Salerno, what's the assessment?
Well, first, it was incredibly close. A near-run thing, as they say. The German 10th Army came very near to driving the Allies back into the sea. Their counterattack was well-timed and exploited that weakness in the Allied initial deployment.
But they failed. Why?
Several reasons. The Germans were also under pressure, their attacks maybe not perfectly coordinated because they had to rush reinforcements in. But the decisive factors really were the Allied soldiers holding the line under immense pressure and that overwhelming, absolutely critical firepower from the Allied navies and air forces. Naval gunfire in particular seems to have been the linchpin during the crisis.
So strategically, Salerno and securing the south a success.
Yes, in the sense that they secured southern Italy, got Naples, got the vital Foggia airfields. But it wasn't the end of the story, more like the end of the beginning for the Italian campaign.
How so?
Because the Germans didn't just collapse, they conducted a skillful withdrawal north and started digging in. They prepared a series of incredibly strong defensive lines, the Volturno line, the Barbara line, the Bernhard line, leading up to the main Gustav line.
Ah, the Gustav line on a
Yeah.
casino.
Exactly. Salerno basically ushered in the next phase, this really brutal, slow, grinding attritional warfare, fighting up the mountainous spine of Italy in terrible autumn and winter weather, which often neutralized Allied advantages in tanks and air power. It became a slogging match against well-prepared defenses. Took them until mid-January 1944 just to reach the Gustav Line.
So not quite the soft underbelly Churchill envisioned.
Not in practice, no. Salerno showed the Germans could fight effectively even after the Italian surrender, and the terrain and weather in Italy made it a defender's paradise. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that led directly into one of the toughest, costliest campaigns for the Western Allies in the entire war.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? A near disaster turned victory, but a victory that opened the door to a long, hard road ahead.
Precisely. It wasn't a simple walk-in. It was a battle decided by firepower, resilience, and maybe a bit of luck, illustrating the human cost and the difficult strategic choices of the wider war.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. Given how close Salerno was, and knowing the brutal campaign that followed the Winter Line, Cassino, Anzio, the slow crawl of the peninsula, how should we view the decision to invade Italy? Did Churchill's soft underbelly strategy ultimately justify the immense cost in lives, resources, and time that the Italian campaign consumed, potentially diverting resources from overlords?